Hey y'all, it's me, CheesyPaninie, and I have decided to start a new series I'm calling Cheesy's Art Diaries, where I talk about my art processes and experiences with certain art pieces I've made. For the longest time, I've mostly posted pixel art, so I thought I'd share something a little different from my usual. In this video, I'll be talking about a thumbnail commission I worked on for the YouTuber Gregan last year. The content of this video is a narrated playthrough of Elden Ring, and Gregan asked me to draw his character wearing full Black Flame monk armor using the Envoy's Longhorn as a weapon as he fights against the Dragon Lord Placidusax. And the art style he wanted me to draw it in was Castlevania. Obviously, my art cannot compare with the original Ayami Kojima, but I try to at least give that painterly feeling for the commission. So first off, I made a pencil sketch of the placements of the Placidusax and the Tarnished. One of the things he told me was that I didn't have to draw both heads if I couldn't, but I wanted a challenge, so I did. I showed him the draft so he could see how I planned to draw it, and he gave me the green light with just a note to give more space between the Placidusax and the Tarnished. I needed to translate what I drew on paper to my computer, and I do this by making solid color silhouettes just so my client could have a better idea of what it's going to look like. I use different colors for each shape so that you can see their forms clearly. I don't use the actual colors for this phase, it's mostly just to figure out the positions of the characters. Because I've never played Elden Ring before, I searched YouTube for some gameplay clips to figure out how it was held and used to draw the character in an accurate stance. Once I found out that it was held like a club, I started searching the internet for references of RPG characters with clubs, but I couldn't find exactly what I needed, so I went for the next best thing, which was to search up baseball players. I couldn't decide which stance was a lot better to use, so I made two versions and let my client choose. It's always much better to let the client handle those kinds of decisions before moving forward, because something you might think is cool might not even be what your client wants. And when I'm doing art commissions, I really want my clients to be able to look at my work and be happy that they chose me to make their vision come to life. Between the two positions, my client preferred the second one where he's facing the dragon. The next phase is adding the lines and extra details. I would have gone straight into the line art for adding finer details in this, but I needed to make sure of the placements again. For people who don't like getting interrupted with what they're doing, this process might feel tiring or frustrating, but for me, it gave me a chance to take a break in between and work on other things, since I also freelance as a writer for game guides and walkthroughs. It also prevents me from needing to do too many revisions. It's better to have a lot of revisions during the drafting phase than during the shading and final rendering where everything is almost final. It would be a big headache. So I asked my client what he preferred. He chose the first option and I went back to work. I drew this in Krita, and I have to say that I just love the program's default brushes, and while it doesn't have the same customizability of Clip Studio Paint, it had everything I needed for this artwork. One of the most important things I wanted to make sure I did consistently was using the same brushes all throughout the process. I had one layer where I just wrote down which brushes I used because I knew at some point I might just forget which is which. I even placed a picture of the art style I'm referencing, which is Castlevania. I used ink brush for the lines and brush and charcoal for the shading and highlights. Of course, there are still times when I do deviate from this when a material has a specific texture, but overall I stuck with these three main brushes. So here I am drawing my derpy ass dragon. It's one of those trust the process moments where you just have to keep going until it looks right. Sometimes my initial line art cannot really give justice to the reference material, and it's only after I've started doing some shading and erasing that the details come to light and it starts to become a very handsome dragon. I don't think he knew this about me when he gave me the prompt, but I was just dying to draw another monster after having the chance to draw one in 2022 for another commission, which I do plan to make a video on sometime in the future. I just don't know when it'll happen. Anyway, I was elated, especially since I got to draw it in a style I don't normally draw in. I really enjoyed the process for this, from the bajillion teeth, the sleek neck, and the glorious mane. And as I'm writing the script, I realized that I think the biggest reason why I love drawing monsters or beasts is because I get a lot of freedom when it comes to shapes and textures. It's like a breath of fresh air after just drawing human faces and clothes all the time growing up. It's not that anyone forced me to do it, it was just the only thing I wanted to draw at the time. And looking back, I think I would have benefited a lot if I experimented with drawing different things. Now, I got a little too excited about this and immediately wanted to see how it would look once I've added some color and highlights, so that's what I did. I painted a goldish base color, yellowish white highlights, and some gray shading, which looked good on those reddish brown lines and detail. And I added a brighter yellow for the eyes to make it pop out. I showed it to my client and he loved it. And I took that as my cue to continue the rest of the artwork in this fashion. The wings were just as fun to draw. I made it look rough and rocky with some damage to it since the Placidusax isn't exactly the most flawless being. I know not all of the details are going to be seen, but I drew them in anyway just in case I needed to adjust the positions again. Of course, both objects, the head and the wing, needed to have their own base color behind the line art so that the lines don't overlap with each other. I took a break from the dragon for a moment to work on the background of the scene. The area where you fight the Placidusax is not really detail heavy and isn't the most important bit. But I wanted to add something that would kind of show you where they are, and the most identifiable thing in the background were the pillars, so I made the silhouettes and placed them in a way where you can catch a glimpse of them. The second dragon was a lot quicker for me to draw since I already know how it should look because I've already drawn the first head. However, I have to admit that it was a little difficult for me to make it look as good as the first head because of this odd angle. I also drew a little bit of the other wing at the bottom. Drawing the tarnish was pretty straightforward. I liked adding all the little details in it, and I spent a bit of time researching what the Black Flame monk armor looked like in different angles. I am just so thankful that there were many people who posted pictures and videos of it online, and I was able to get all the references that I needed even without playing the game. Weapon was actually the most interesting and intricate part. It was hard to make the envoy's longhorn look right when I was trying to draw it in this angle. It looked very misshapen and kind of like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Yeah. So what I did instead to make it look symmetrical is to draw it vertically first while using a symmetrical ruler so that my lines are mirrored on the other side. Once I got the main shapes, I turned off the ruler and added the curves that wrapped around the weapon. I made a lot of progress since the last time I updated my client, so I showed him what I have so far. The first option had the second head at the lower right with a bit of its wing peeking from the bottom, while the second option had the second head lowered and angled a bit differently. And I removed the other wing because I thought it might have made the thumbnail feel too crowded with it there. My client liked both of them and left me to choose which one I liked more, and I chose the second one. Looking back at it a year later, I would have made the first dragon head a little smaller and the second a little bigger to add a bit of perspective and depth. I might have also moved the man a little bit more to the left, but that's just me nitpicking on my old works. I do think it's healthy to sometimes review what you've made in the past to see how far you've come in your art journey. And it can also serve as a great learning tool. But I think one thing I want to avoid as much as possible is going back to my previous finished work and revising something because I saw something that looked weird to me, because I'm most likely going to let my perfectionism take over to the point where I cannot graduate from an art piece. Of course, when it's a commission, I'll happily revise anything that needs to be revised, within reason. If the revision is too major, I'm gonna need to charge extra for that or decline. But if it's personal work, I can't touch it anymore. I'd rather start over or draw something else. Since the work I've done has been approved, I began refining the details and the line art, starting with the Envoy's Longhorn. At first, I was going to draw random shapes as textures, but upon closer inspection, there's actually this really interesting pattern on it. Once I've drawn it to completion, I added some shading, then used my eraser to remove bits of it to keep the pattern subtle, just like in the reference. For the furry part of the man's hood, please don't take that out of context. I painted some light shading, then added thin lines to define the soft texture, then added a bit of darker shading. For the hood itself, since it's actually made of chainmail, or at least the texture seemed to look like chainmail, I used a brush called Rake and further defined it by adding shading and erasing some parts for the highlights with my 3 main brushes. For the fabric parts itself, I used the stamp floor brush, and for the metallic parts, I used chalk grainy brush and erased some parts to highlight certain areas. The shading for the face is pretty simple. Most of the intricate details actually went to the facial hair. I did this by first filling in the rest of the beard with a solid color, then erasing some to draw strands to make the texture of the hair. Back in the day, I would draw all of the strands by hand, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's a style in itself. But I realized that for hair to look like hair, sometimes it's enough to have just a solid color and just a few hints of the strands to make its texture. It looks good and it saves a lot of time. Now it's time for the coloring phase. I have to admit that once I finished the details and showed it to my client, I didn't wait for his go signal before I started coloring it, because I was just so excited to see what it was going to look like. For the artists that are doing commissions, please do not do this. Do not do this. It'll be a real nightmare if there were major revisions. Unfortunate that there weren't, and he just asked to make that piece over his face a little longer. Anyways, for the colors, I actually started over from scratch instead of using the one I made before. Actually, don't remember why I decided to do that. I think I might have wanted the shading to be consistent for all 3 parts of the dragon or something. I actually experimented quite a bit in this phase and tried a bunch of different things until I was satisfied with how the colors blended before doing the second head and the wing. I really like the combination of gold, gray with a hint of orange or green, so I made sure to make that a consistent theme when coloring this piece, including the player character. Even though the character is wearing white and some gold, I made it the same overall hue as the dragon to tie it all together and make it feel like they are in the same environment with the same lighting. The bubbles were added in later, starting off as line blobs, then filling it with a translucent base color, lowering the opacity of the lines, adding lighter lines and even lighter highlights, adjusting color blending and opacity, and then adding a bit of motion lines and blur. I also added a bit of detail to the pillar silhouettes, which I now realize wasn't really that important at all because it got covered by all the bubbles, so it's a good thing I didn't put too much effort into it. And to complete the ambience of the scene, I added a little bit of fog around them. And this is the finished piece. Looking back, I feel like there were a little bit too much going on here. I feel like the piece would have looked a little more organic if the bubbles were of different sizes and there were a lot more blank spaces to let the art breathe. I do think that this piece would have stood out a little bit more if I made the wings tip disappear a bit to the fog and made the second dragon's head a little brighter than the first one, just to make it look like it's closer to the camera. But overall, I'm really proud of this artwork and I enjoyed doing all those textures I don't normally do with pixel art. I hope you guys learned something or enjoyed hearing me yap about my art process. I realized that I just don't like making tutorials, but I do like talking about my works and hopefully people would enjoy it as much as I did making it. And I have decided to, once again, try putting everything on this channel because I only have time in my life for one channel. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really enjoy breaking down what I've done, just like when I used to do tutorial videos, which are going to come back at some point. But I want to take my time with that one. And I want to do more of these kinds of videos along with my other types of content. And I hope you guys look forward to it. For now, I'm just gonna go do my thing and you guys do your thing and I'll see you guys later. Take it easy and stay cheesy.